Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to tonight's program, I So Declare It, Theodore Roosevelt's Conservation Crusade for America. We ask that you please silence your cell phones. And then the program tonight will occur in 3 parts. First, Mr. Roosevelt will share some of his experiences, and then you, the audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions of President Roosevelt. And then finally, the scholar behind Teddy Roosevelt, Kurt Skinner, will take your questions about Mr. Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt imprinted his love of the natural world onto America as our wilderness warrior president. He fought for our national treasures, and he left a legacy of federal resources in conservation and wildlife protection. So, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the 26th President of the United States, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt.
Good evening, dear citizens. Delighted to be here with you in southern Colorado. This is Vali. Thank you for so many of you coming here tonight. This is delightful. This Colorado mountain air makes me feel fit as a bull moose, toughened as a hickory nut. I want to heartily congratulate you for 37 years of successfully hosting a festival devoted solely to the migratory patterns of one of our great birds, the sandhill crane. Vali from Monte Vista in San Luis Valley. It was a delightful morning I spent out this morning watching those thousands of sandhill cranes frolicking out there in the wildlife refuge. And this has been a great thrill for me. You see, for me, birdsong is attached to memories of place and time. And for me, forever, I think, the sandhill crane, that barking, croaking call of the sandhill crane will now be forever associated in my memory of my time spent in its presence today and in yours in the San Luis Valley. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. To be congratulated also and thanked the great many sponsors who made this weekend possible. The wildlife refuge staff, I understand they are so exhausted they cannot be here tonight, but then also the great many volunteers who made this weekend possible. I do hope that my microphone continues to work. I do hope that this continues into a great, perhaps into at least the 22nd century. Some of you may not be here to see that, but I do hope so. Now, like you, first and foremost, I'm a birder. I may have been known as a politician or a soldier or a statesman, perhaps a writer, a hunter naturalist, but for me, it's always been about the birds. I fell in love with birds as a boy, and I have been faithfully devoted to them for my entire life, I believe. As a young boy, I was reading. Well, I wasn't reading. Before I could even read, I would look at the pictures of John James Audubon's tremendous book, his painted plates of these colorful birds, and sitting in my little reading rocking chair in my father's library, and I was fascinated by these birds. And these plates, these colorful plates, opened up the greater world of birds beyond my New York City apartment that we lived in. And for me, birds represented the outer world that was sometimes inaccessible to me. See, I was a weak and sickly little child of poor eyesight. I was nearsighted, and I often couldn't see the birds beyond my windowsill, but I could hear them. And I think the fact that I couldn't see the birds, it sharpened this keen sense of appreciation for bird song in me. And I came to greatly appreciate bird song. Now, my own musical ability and appreciation, I am told by my family that I am tone deaf. You see, I like a good American John Philip Sousa march, which holds about the same musical appeal to my family as a poorly played set of bagpipes, perhaps. Nonetheless, it's birdsong that has been the soundtrack of my life. And every aspect of my life and my career and every place I have traveled, it's been birdsong that keenly attached memories that I have of that place. So much so that after my presidency, I spent 1 year in a collecting expedition for the Smithsonian Institution in East Africa. In East Africa. And yes, I was homesick for my family, but it was the birds of North America that I missed tremendously. And I wrote about the birds. You know, my biographers, in fact, they have been curious at the fact that I devoted over 10 pages in my autobiography talking about birds. This is no surprise to me, though, but will you allow me to read something that I wrote while in East Africa, remembering my time of the North American birds? You see, I might be described as an ornithological patriot, because it's American birds that I prefer. Give me an American bird every time. Allow me to read. Many of the African birds are beautiful, though to my ears, not as beautiful as the best of our own bird songs. At any rate, there is nothing that quite corresponds to the chorus that during May and June moves northward from the Gulf states and Southern California to Maine and Minnesota and Oregon and to Ontario and Saskatchewan, when mockingbirds and cardinals sing in the magnolia groves of the south, and the hermit thrushes, winter wrens, and the sweetheart sparrows in the spruce and hemlock forests of the north, when the bobolinks in the east and the meadowlarks in the east and the west sing in the fields, and the water ousels by the cold streams of the Rockies, and the canyon wrens in their sheer gorges, when from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific, wood thrushes, varies, robins, bluebirds, orioles, thrushes, catbirds, house finches, song sparrows, and many other singers thrill the gardens at sunrise, until the long days begin to shorten, and the tawny lilies burn by the roadside, and the indigo buntings trill forth from the tops of the little trees throughout the hot afternoons. I'm a bit of a literary feller, aren't I? So yes, the birds. The birds have been with me my entire life. But I can remember, not just the birds, but I can remember perhaps the start, the day that I became a zoologist. See, I was 7 years old, and Mother had sent me down the street, down Broadway, to get strawberries for the morning breakfast. And there at the market, on a wooden slab laid out in front of the marketplace, was a dead seal carcass. How exciting, right? I tell you, the sight of that seal filled me with every sense of romance and adventure, as it should every person, I think. And I inquired about that seal, and he said that it was from the harbor, but I imagined all of the worldly adventures that seal had in its lifetime. And I started returning every single day back to that market, and I took with me my pocket ruler, and I started some very unscientific measurements of that seal. And day after day, I returned to the site of the seal, laying there steadily decaying on the wooden slab out in front of the market. And I began to write up my own 7-year-old version of the natural history of that seal, and I dreamt of possessing it. And finally, just before the marketplace was ready it had lost its appeal as a memento for drawing curiosity, and now people were just disgusted by it. And I asked for its carcass. And the market owner, he did me the great courtesy of hacking off the seal's head. He wrapped it in newspaper for me, and off I went home carrying the seal's skull. You can just imagine how excited my mother was to see little Teeny dragging home a disgusting seal skull. But she got the cook to help me remove some of the meat so that I could further inspect the skull underneath. And that was the start of my zoological career. And like most boys, I started to collect all the other crawling and flying insects that I could come up with. And at the age of 9, maybe you've read this, I wrote The Natural History of Insects. And in the preface, I wrote, in this book, I describe the insects of North America. And some of my friends have told me some things about these insects, but most of which I have observed their habits through close observation. You see, I believed that my 9-year-old self possessed the ability to mimic the work of John James Audubon and Charles Darwin. And I began to grow my collection, and little by little, it grew into what I described as the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. And I started to recruit some of my friends and family to bring specimens, any four-legged creature. And I put a bounty price of any creature that was brought to me. And my father did something wonderful for me. He introduced me to James Bell, who had been the taxidermy assistant to the great John James Audubon. And it's at this point where I went from being a normal, messy boy to being a truly disgusting boy that always had the smell of death about him. Formaldehyde and various other tools of the trade. My brother Elliot refused to share a bathroom with me because he said I was routinely leaving the internal organs of the animals I worked upon in the basin of the sink. I received, and this is exciting, one day I received a dead woodchuck. And well, like most boys would do, I asked the cook to boil it down for 24 hours to try to remove the meat from the skeleton. And I can tell you, she did it, but it caused a tremendous stink in the kitchen in more ways than one. The cook, you see, threatened my mother, either the woodchuck goes or I do. And like most boys, I kept snakes in water pitchers, and I had a squirrel I was trying to tame in my bedroom. And our housekeeper complained to my mother, how in the world can I do the laundry with a snapping turtle tied to the leg of the wash basin? But my parents, you see, my father and my mother, they encouraged me warmly in my natural history collecting. And as they really did in almost anything that would bring me wholesome pleasure or seek to develop me in some way. And it was a tremendous gift. My mother had her limitations, though. When she found a small collection of dead field mice that I was keeping in refrigeration in our icebox in our kitchen, and she threw them out. I pleaded with her, Mother, the loss to science is tremendous. She was unmoved. So my collecting increased. In the year of my 13th birthday, when I got two very important things. The first, my father got me a small gauge shotgun. And in our summer home in Long Island, I used that shotgun and I started blazing away at the trees of Long Island in the direction of birds. You see, I was still nearsighted. I could hear the birds, but I couldn't see them well. And I noticed that my friends going with me on these collecting expeditions, that they could actually hit their targets and I couldn't. And that's when I got my spectacles. And Father had me fitted, and it's at that point that the world opened up to me, and for the first time in my life, I realized that the trees had individual leaves upon them, blades of grass I could delineate, and it was the birds that came alive to me. And suddenly those plates in John James Audubon's books were alive to me in the trees, and I could see the brilliant colors and the patterns. And probably I engaged in a little too much youthful enthusiasm in my collecting, and I over-collected far too many of the songbirds of New York. I regretted that, but I reformed my ways. I did reform my ways. And trust me, I did reform my ways. I'm accused of blasting away at anything that moves, you see. We'll get to that later. But I did. My collection increased dramatically when I got the shotgun and the spectacles. But eventually my collection grew large enough that it had to be moved to the upstairs, out of the way hallway, and conveniently our house staff didn't mutiny. Mother was happier. And I assumed when I went off to Harvard as an 18-year-old young man that I would be majoring in the natural sciences, and that I would become a hunter naturalist, a field naturalist in the tradition of John James Audubon and Darwin. And that's how I styled myself. But you see, at Harvard, by the late 1800s, they were a very closed-minded bunch. And there was a failure to recognize the great work that could be done by a field naturalist, and everything had to be done in the laboratory with minuteness and exactness. And if it couldn't be done so, they viewed field naturalism as unscientific and unimportant. But you see, my tastes were specialized in a very different direction. And I had no more desire or inclination or ability to become a section cutter in the laboratory or a microscopist than I was to become a mathematician, God forbid. And so, as you know, I pursued a career in politics and government service. But I kept an avocational life as a hunter naturalist, and I took every opportunity that I could to take extended hunting trips, no matter what was going on else in my life, to take an extended hunting trip, and I would write about my experiences. And I actually had great success as a naturalist writer. In fact, writing is what kept me in the red. Eventually in the black. You see, there was no presidential retirement check in my time. I had to earn my retirement the old-fashioned way by working for it. And I inherited it the old-fashioned way as well, like some presidents from New York City. So I did. I pursued hunting. Avocationally. And it reminds me, it's what first brought me west. I'm known as a Western president. I was born in New York City, but I'm known as a Westerner and a cowboy, and it's because I went west as a young man, and it was a bison hunt that first drew me to the West. And I'm delighted today to know that bison have been restored in great numbers, and that there are tens of thousands under federal conservation herds, and perhaps 500,000 I have understood that are being commercially raised today. And that's tremendous. But it was the bison. It was the thrill of the bison. It represented to me all that was wild about the West and the adventure stories that I had read as a young boy. My heroes were the adventurers and the explorers like Lewis and Clark, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Kit Carson. And I read those stories of how the bison in the 1800s, they would just blacken the fields in numbers that were uncountable. And I wanted to experience some of that excitement for myself, and I wanted a trophy for my new home that was being built on Sagamore Hill in Long Island. And so as a 24-year-old man, as a newlywed, as a young New York congressman, an expectant father, I took off to the west on the Northern Union Railroad, Northern Pacific, as far as it would go to the Dakota Territory, where it crossed the Little Missouri River to a place today called Medora, North Dakota. Maybe some of you have been there. I understand there is a tremendous national park there. You should see it. But at Medora, the first thing I did when I got off the train, I sought out a guide, Mr. Joe Ferris, and I asked him to help me find a bison. You see, in that vicinity, just a year before, and this was 1883, just a year before, there were thousands of bison that had been hunted just in that vicinity. But for 2 weeks, we were on the trail of what seemed to be the last remaining bison in North America. 2 weeks. Finally, there it was, and I spotted the bison. And it was some distance away, and I couldn't creep up behind foliage. If you've been to North Dakota, you know what I mean. Not a state known for its dense forestation. So I was forced to crawl upon hands and knees towards this bison to close the distance. And in my excitement, I stumbled right into this patch of cactus, filling my hands and knees with painful tiny needles. And my spectacles were fogging up with all the exertion, and I believed that I could make out the bison. And I leveled my rifle, and I took aim, and I missed. And off went that bison. And it was another week before I got another opportunity. And there it was on the horizon. The moon was rising over the North Dakota prairie, and the bison was there in the dusk. I was on horseback, and I decided that if the Indians could hunt bison on horseback, then so could Theodore Roosevelt. And I decided to ride directly at it, but it was just then that the bison turned on me and charged directly at my horse. My horse spooked, raised up, knocked the barrel of my rifle square into my forehead, causing a very impressive gash, and through the blood that was pouring into my eyes, I could just make out the image of the bison running past my horse and into the night. But on the third try, there was success. And I did what I imagined to be some sort of a celebratory Indian dance and tipped my guy, Joe Ferris, a $100 bill on the spot. I was so excited, the first thing I did when I got back to Medora is I made an offer. I put the money down on a cattle ranch, and on the spot, without consulting Mrs. Roosevelt, I was a cattle rancher in the Dakota Territory now. The first of 2 ranches that I would have in the Dakota Territory. I would sink up to 1/3 of my total inheritance into the cattle business. Lost my shirt. The blizzards of 1886 and 87. Some of the worst blizzards in Dakota Territory history. And that is saying something in North Dakota. The cattle were stuck in the tops of the trees they found in the springtime. The snow was so deep. Yes. But it got me thinking just how difficult that bison was to get, that the numbers of our big game creatures were so dwindling. Were we humans responsible for the near extermination and extinction of a species, was there something that I could do? And I combined my interests in conservation and my love of hunting to form something called the Boone and Crockett Club. This was a collection of gentlemen sport hunters who we set about our task was to reform the hunting culture of North America through our example, to create more humane hunting practices and encourage the fair chase rules and work towards game preserves being established in the West, encouraging the states to adopt hunting regulations, bag limits. We were relatively unsuccessful at first, but we pursued that goal. You know, the bison weren't always so scarce. The numbers, perhaps in the mid-1800s, there were more bison than people in the mid-1800s. Perhaps 40 to 50 million of the creatures. So what happened to the bison? Well, as you probably know, it's that greatest invention, that greatest industrial revolutionary achievement of the 1800s, the Transcontinental Railway, had divided and subdivided out all the migratory routes of the North American bison and made them for the first time accessible to the modern breech-loading rifle. And the market hunters, who couldn't seem to meet the insatiable demand for bison hides, buffalo as they were called, for buffalo hides in the East and in Europe. And these market hunters, or game butchers, let's call them for what they are, one game butcher in the late 1800s, armed with a modern breech-loading rifle and endless amounts of cartridges, could in a single hour kill over 100 bison from a stationary hilltop position. This was disgraceful. Disgraceful. But again, what could be done? An unfortunate Indian removal policy saw that the removal of the bison was contingent upon the removal of the Indians. And as my friend John Muir has observed, nothing in nature can be safe once man places a dollar value upon it. And a bison hide would today in your dollars fetch about $75. Sometimes bison were killed merely to extract the tongue to be sold as a delicacy in East Coast restaurants for a few dollars. Often, though, the railroads would merely hand out free ammunition so passengers could just shoot for fun the bison as the trains went through. This is unfortunate business. By the early 1890s, it was estimated there were only perhaps less than 1,000 free-roaming bison in America, and they resided within the confines of our first great national park at Yellowstone in Wyoming. But there were no laws to protect those creatures within the national park boundaries. Any person could go into this national park, Yellowstone, and gun down the bison with virtually little punishment. Why, there was in fact greater punishment would befall the poacher who killed an army mule than if he killed one of the last specimens of this great American creature within the national park boundaries. It's disgraceful. Congress, by their inaction through the years, had placed a premium price upon the head of each one of those bison. So what could be done? And it happened. One early morning in late winter, 1894, February, this despicable little poacher by the name of Howell was caught red-handed butchering out, hacking the heads off of a dozen bison that had been helplessly stuck in the winter snows of Yellowstone Basin. And the superintendent was powerless to do anything other than confiscate his rifle and escort him from the park. But you see, fortune smiled on our efforts that day. There was a reporting crew from Forest and Stream magazine, hunting magazine, later becomes Field and Stream. They were in the park that day to interview the park superintendent. But they were there to capture this carnage firsthand. And that's when the Boone and Crockett Club sprang into action. We ensured that that story was run in newspapers all across America. Whoever would print the thing, we got it into the papers. And do you know, I mean, think of this. Over the past few decades, there had been a systematic extermination of this creature, but now one sympathetic story of 12 helpless bison in our great national park, Yellowstone, it raised the righteous indignation of the American people at the impending destruction of this uniquely American creature. And then it happened. The American people started to put pressure upon their congressmen, and the fight in Congress was led by my friend, Representative John Lacey, an Iowa representative, Civil War veteran, and a good Boone and Crockett Club man, I'd have you know. He led the effort in Congress to pass what became known as the Yellowstone Park Protection Act, which gave for the first time the federal government the ability to prosecute poachers within our park boundaries. Now, normally I have seen that Congress can very often be the opposite of progress, but in this case, I say, bully for Congress! So, the fight for the bison was underway, and some of the very first park protections were put in place. Finally, I made friends with one of our great bison experts of the day, Mr. William Hornady. And Mr. William Hornady was, again, the leading expert in bison in North America. And we hatched a plan that we would try to save the bison by rounding up some of these few specimens from Yellowstone and perhaps some of the private herds. And we would breed them back into greater numbers, breed them in captivity. Now, were it up to you, where would you choose to breed the great American bison in captivity? You, sir?
North Dakota.
In North Dakota. Okay, North Dakota, that's fine. Anyone else? Where would you choose to breed the great American bison in captivity? Any place other than North Dakota?
Wyoming.
In Wyoming, okay. The bison's on the flag. What a good, that's a good choice. We chose New York City. You see, I had just helped establish the Bronx Zoological Park in my hometown of New York City. So we decided that we would round up, we put these bison on trains and hauled them back to New York City. And Mr. Hornady set about to try to grow some of the western grasses. And do you know it's more difficult to grow western grasses in New York City than it sounds? In the meantime, Mr. Hornady hand-fed those bison. Hand-fed those bison. Amazing, amazing man. Well, I digress here. Get me talking about my bison. So, we're here to talk about conservation. Here to talk about conservation, are we not? In late 1800s, you probably know that my attention was diverted away from conservation efforts towards the national military situation, and I was named the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. You see, probably like most industrious college seniors, I wrote a book. It was called The Naval War of 1812, and in that I described how we were woefully unprepared for the War of 1812, and it encouraged the building of a strong navy, and it became required reading of every officer in the United States Navy. And on the merit of that, and some personal connections. I was named the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I was just in my 30s. And then the war came with Spain. Remember the Maine. Our battleship Maine blew up in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, in the spring of 1898, killing 266 American servicemen. And then we were at war with Spain. And I resigned my post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and took up a commission as a Lieutenant Colonel in the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, a regiment that I raised primarily from recruits, volunteers from the Western Territories, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, and a good sprinkled in for good measure some East Coast elites. Men from Harvard and Yale and Columbia. We had the captain of the U.S. polo team in the Rough Riders, as we became known. We had the number 1 and the number 2 tennis players in the world in the Rough Riders. We had the grandson of a former Secretary of State. We had members of some of the finest families of the East Coast elite in the Rough Riders, serving right alongside some of these ruffians who had been ranchers and cowpokes and lawmen of the Western Territories. The men that I had become familiar with with the character of the Westerner. It gave me legitimacy to raise this regiment. You probably know the rest of the story. We went on to win a certain amount of fame. You see, the American people, the imagination of the American people were captured by this group of Rough Riders, because it seemed to encapsulate how Americans wanted to see themselves at the end of the century, as we were a growing nation, becoming a semi-imperialist nation, as some would say. And the Rough Riders captured that imagination and that spirit, and the stories of Rough Riders made it into every paper across North America, and something about my face was just distinctive enough that I became the most recognizable man in all of America, it seemed, and a bona fide war hero. And so I returned after my 4 months in military uniform as a national war hero, and we were mustered out after the very brief Spanish-American War, a splendid little war, as it was called by some. And we were mustered out just in time for the New York Republican Party to want to run me for governor in the year of 1898. I had 5 weeks in which to campaign. I took with me the Rough Riders. Your campaigns last a good deal longer now, I understand. I took with me the Rough Riders, who had just recently mustered out, some of them still in their khaki uniforms, very distinctive khaki uniform with lemon yellow trimmings. And everywhere I campaigned across New York, train would stop, every little town and burg through New York State. Sometimes there wasn't even a rail station, but we would stop. A local band would play the Star Spangled Banner, and there'll be a hot time in the old town tonight, which had become the de facto theme song of the Rough Riders. And the New York people didn't really want to know what Theodore Roosevelt thought about the issues of the day in New York State, about my opinion on monetary policy. They wanted to hear stories about Cuba and the Rough Riders. So guess what? That's what they got. So I took with me the Rough Riders, again, to campaign, and my voice sometimes would nearly go hoarse and go out, and some of my Rough Riders would actually help campaign for me. And at one particular stop, one of my sergeants, who had been a Texas Ranger, asked, "Colonel, is it okay if I introduce you at the next stop?" And so, of course, I conceded. When the train stopped, this sergeant, he says to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you about my colonel. You see, in Cuba, he promised us there'd be some hard fighting and dying, and he was with us every step of the way. And when it came time to charge up San Juan Hill and plant the American flag on the top, he led us like lambs to the slaughter. And when you elect him governor, he'll do the same for you. It didn't seem to be very complimentary of my military ability, but it seemed to do me no particular harm. And I was elected governor in 1898 of my home state of New York. And what a bully job that was. It was a job that I had often thought about as a young man, to actually become the governor of the state of New York and take up the governor's residence in Albany. And I quickly set about to make New York State a conservation example to the nation. And I began to institute some progressive reforms, doing my best to try to get those moneyed interests and their political power influencing our system in New York State out of the positions of influence. And that was where I screwed up, apparently. Because the New York State Republican Party saw me as the troublemaker at that point. I was disrupting the politics as usual. I was disrupting the status quo. A progressive in the Republican Party in the state of New York in the late 1800s was anathema. And so those Republican Party leaders sought to look about, how do we get rid of Roosevelt without killing him? And in casting about, they actually had the ear of the President of the United States, Mr. William McKinley. And in time, they began to convince Mr. McKinley that he needed a young, energetic, popular war hero on the ticket in 1900. In other words, me. Now, I enjoyed my job as governor, and I didn't want to leave it. But I was told that I might as well stand under Niagara Falls and attempt to reverse its flow than to try to deny the nomination for the vice president in the year 1900. You see, there was an opening in the vice presidency. The current vice president, under Mr. McKinley, Mr. Garrett Hobart, had died in office previous winter. As a matter of fact, he was the 6th vice president to die in office in American history. And I suppose those Republican conservative leaders hoped perhaps I'd be lucky number 7. So like a good soldier, I saluted and off I went on the campaign trail, campaigning for Mr. William McKinley, re-election in the 1900. And we thoroughly trounced the Democrats in that election. That populist, William Jennings Bryan, didn't stand a chance. And it's at that point that I realized what I had done. That for the next 4 years of my life, I was to be relegated to that political purgatory known as the vice presidency. A job that one of the vice presidents under my little cousin Franklin once called not worth a bucket of warm spit. I would have to concur. It sounded horrible. My entire job duties, as I understood them, was to preside over the last 3 days of the Senate in March and host many dinner parties for the next 4 years, which sounded dreadful. But what was I to do? I was a good soldier in the Republican Party. So I settled in and started wondering what in the world was I going to do with myself for the next 4 years. So I started writing books. I went on as many hunting trips as I could. And then, as you probably know, only 6 months into Mr. McKinley's second term, a filthy little anarchist went right up to him when he was at the Buffalo Pan American Exposition and shot him point blank in the stomach. And so I was rushed as vice president to the bedside of Mr. President McKinley, and I sat with him for 3 days at his bedside, and I began to feel a bit like one of those vultures eyeing his next meal, until finally the doctor said, "We think he's going to recover, so you can take off now, Mr. Roosevelt." And so off I went. What was I to do? I was a New Yorker in my home state. So I went climbing a mountain, like any normal person would do. I hopped on a train and went across the state to the Adirondacks, and I hiked Mount Mossy, the highest peak in all of New York. And it was a glorious sight at the top, but there I also began to wonder, had I scaled the highest peaks of my political career? Was I to be stalled out as vice president? Because the Republican Party were already looking about in 1904, and there were other names other than Theodore Roosevelt being bandied about for 1904. And then on my hike down the mountain, I was confronted by a very out-of-breath, exasperated park ranger waving some telegrams, and my fears were confirmed that Mr. McKinley had taken a turn for the worst, and that I was to hop back in the train through the night and go back to Buffalo and be by his side. When I arrived the next morning, I was greeted with the news that President McKinley had died, and that I, Theodore Roosevelt, that morning, in a borrowed frock coat, at the age of 42, was to become the youngest and 26th President of the United States of America. And I understand those conservative party bosses at some point said, "Now look what we've done. The damn cowboy's in the White House now." And what a bully cowboy ride it has been. I have to tell you, no man has had more fun as president than I have in my 7.5 years in the White House. What a bully ride it has been. The presidency, I must tell you, is a bully pulpit from which to preach to the American people. And I have preached the message of the strenuous life for the individual and for this nation, a life of a square deal for all the American people. Fairness. But more than anything else, I was a conservative. I was a progressive on conservation matters. And that is my contribution, I think, to the American people. Is I made conservation something of a mainstream issue for the American people. I normalized the idea that we shouldn't be slaughtering. If we could have any role in playing of not causing animals to go towards extinction, if we had any role in preserving habitats for these creatures, then it was our American duty. A duty of citizenship, I believe, is to be a conservationist. And one of my first opportunities to exercise this political power came from my friend Frank Chapman, who was the head ornithologist of the American Museum of Natural History, which, by the way, my father was a co-founder and one of the board members. Its charter was actually signed in the living room of my home in New York City when I was a boy. Mr. Frank Chapman, head ornithologist, a good friend of mine, and a goodly number of the Audubon Society members of Florida started deluging my office with these letters telling me that, Mr. President, for yet another year, millions of migratory fowl in Florida are to be slaughtered by these game butchers, and their little youngings will starve to death unless something can be done. So I brought together my legal team, my Attorney General, Mr. Philander Knox, and I asked him, is there anything in the Constitution and all the laws of America which would prevent me from naming Pelican Island, which was this last stopover on the migratory route on the Atlantic seaboard for the brown pelican? Is there anything which would prohibit me from naming this a federal bird sanctuary. And he hemmed and hawed and finally came back to me and said, "No, sir, Mr. President, I don't believe that there is anything prohibiting you from doing so." I said, "So, there we have it. Pelican Island is hereby a federal bird sanctuary. I so declare it." Thank you, yes. Only for us. And that became the first of 51 federal bird sanctuaries that I set aside during my time as president, which, as you probably know, this is an educated audience here. As you know, it becomes the basis of the wildlife refuge system, now today managed by our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'm very proud of that achievement. But you have to understand, Congress had not authorized the funding for agents to actually protect the birds within these new federal bird sanctuaries. And it fell upon the Audubon societies within each of the states to actually fund the salaries for these first game wardens, and it was dangerous work. As some of you may know, during my time as president, 3 game wardens gave their lives in defense of these endangered birds on federal game preserves. I want to read their names. Mr. Guy Bradley, Mr. Columbus McLeod, Mr. Presley Reeves gave, as Lincoln said, that last full measure of devotion in defense of helpless endangered birds in our federal game system. And I think it's fitting and proper that we remember that sacrifice, these heroes of conservation. You see, these birds were being slaughtered for their plumage, for their feathers. The feathers of a snowy white egret were actually worth more per ounce than gold. Women, in my day, found it fashionable to adorn their hats with the feathers and plumage of these exotic migratory fowl, and they were being hunted nearly to extinction by these game butchers in southern Florida. They were suffering, ironically, the same fate as another species, the beaver, which had been hunted nearly to extinction so that we would have fine hats. Now this is terrible. I happen to believe that birds look tremendously much better in swamps and on the shorelines and in the woods and in forests and trees than they do on women's hats. But there is no explaining fashion, as you know. No explaining. And I saw with the success of saving these bird preserves that what other types of big game animal preserves might be brought about under federal or executive order. Back to the bison. Mr. Hornady was successful in breeding those bison in the Bronx Zoological Gardens. And we reintroduced those bison in the federal game preserves, the bison preserves in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, and the bison preserve of Montana. And we established 2 other game preserves for big game creatures by executive order. I so declare it. And the bison that you see today in our state and national parks out west very well could be the genetic offspring of those bison raised and hand-fed by Mr. Hornady in the Bronx. Perhaps if you listen very closly, you may detect a New York accent. Now, as you know, there's something else that presidents can do by executive order. Don't ask me how it happened, but Mr. Lacey was able to sneak another act of legislation through the Congress in 1906 called the Antiquities Act, which was designed to set aside, in the smallest areas possible, areas of scientific or unique archaeological interest for the American people. And the Antiquities Act gives the President of the United States that authority without the permission of Congress. I so declare it. And Devil's Tower in Wyoming became my first national monument that I named, and it became the first of 18 national monuments that I named. One here in Colorado, perhaps you're familiar with it, Wheeler National Monument. Some of you locals know. I wish there was reason to applaud. As you probably know, Wheeler fell into a bit of disuse. With the advent of the automobile, it became so unvisited that the state of Colorado wasn't taking proper care of it apparently, and it's now something called the Wheeler Geological Site. But the site, the pictures of it reminded me of the Badlands, and I had to declare it a national monument. I probably stretched my constitutional authority with one of my last national monuments, the Grand Canyon. You see, the Grand Canyon was under threat. It was under threat by Western mining interests, and Western senators were in the back pocket of the mining industry. Well, that's unusual, yes? And the railroad industry, which had plans to construct rail lines directly up to the rim of the Grand Canyon and start constructing these terrible hotels all around the rim. Mining operations for zinc and asbestos and copper were already planned. And when I first visited the Grand Canyon in 1903 on a presidential visit, Theodore Roosevelt, was left speechless. But I said to those people, leave this great place as it is. The ages have been at work upon this place, and man can only mar it. Leave it for your children and your children's children. It is a national treasure. Europe has its cathedrals, it has its Notre Dame, it has its Parthenon. Those are just monuments to man's ability, monuments to himself. We have the Grand Canyon, and it was under threat of becoming one giant open pit mining project. I did the only thing that I could. I set aside the smallest possible amount that I could in compliance with the Antiquities Act, which was about 800,000 acres of the Grand Canyon. I so declare it. It is a national monument. And in time, it became a national park. National parks. Everywhere I go today, I'm told, thank you, Mr. Roosevelt, for creating the national park system. I wish I could take credit for that, but it pre-existed. National parks had already been named. Our first great national park, Yellowstone National Park, was named under President Grant, as you may know, in 1872. The National Park Service just celebrated its 100th birthday in 2016. Probably the only real thing that came out of Mr. Wilson's administration that was worth anything. But yes, the president alone cannot so declare a national park. It takes an act of Congress. And I was able to get 5 new national parks through. And Congress, I have to tell you, in my day, Congress was a very, how shall I say, a very non-forward-looking group. focused on their own monetary interest, short-focused. In my frustration, I may have called the Senate that great collection of shrill eunuchs. The Speaker of the House, a member of my own Republican Party, Mr. Joe Cannon, famously said, "Not one single red cent for scenery." Well, you know, our national parks are not scenery. The great Colorado Canyon of the Grand Canyon, the Yellowstone, these majestic groves of these sequoia and the redwoods of California, these are our cathedrals. These are the place where Americans have always been able to, and I pray always will be able to go to renew their spirits. These are not scenery, Mr. Cannon. These are our treasures. And it's up to us to protect them and see them for what they are. So our national parks, one right here in the state of Colorado, Mesa Verde National Park. Those Anasazi Indian ruins down in the south. On my first park, Crater Lake in Oregon, one of the deepest natural lakes, the old extinct volcano there, approximately 2,000 feet deep of water. Platte National Park. Anybody familiar with Platte National Park? Yes, sir, Platte National Park. Where would you go to visit Platte National Park?
I think it was in Oklahoma.
Yes, sir, in Oklahoma. It has since reverted over to the Chickasaw recreational area now. And then there is Sully's Hill National Park. How many people have been to Sully's Hill National Park? You, sir. Sully's, you, ma'am. Sully's Hill. Where is Sully's Hill National Park?
Near Devil's Lake, North Dakota.
Devil's Lake, North Dakota. Very good, sir. Devil's Lake, North Dakota. Most of you have not heard of Sully's Hill National Park. You see, there was a senator who was the head of the land, what was it? The Land Committee, Public Lands Committee. He was from Devil's Lake, North Dakota. And so Sully's Hill National Park became a thing during my administration, and within the next generation of presidents, it was downgraded to a game preserve. Now I understand. No, I was not referring to that other national park in North Dakota. Yes, sir?
The name of Sully's Hill is no longer. It has been changed
And what's it changed to now, sir?
to White Horse Hill.
White Horse Hill.
That has just taken place in about the last few months.
Thank you very much. When I set up the national park in North Dakota, I can assure you, Congress was not in a mood to name a national park after Theodore Roosevelt. But if you go to North Dakota today, you can visit at the gateway there, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, Medora, North Dakota. So I would highly encourage you to do so. One of the final things that I was able to do, I understood that our wildlife needed habitat. It's not enough to say that you're going to protect and set aside some of the wild places. We still need the national forests. And national forests, I didn't invent the idea of national forests either. My predecessors in the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, President Harrison signed that bill, and he set aside approximately, if my numbers are correct, about 7 million acres of national forests, and his successor, Mr. Cleveland, set aside about another 13 million. Mr. McKinley set aside another 25 million acres for about 45 million acres of national forests. I tripled that number to 150 million acres of national forests, many of which are right here in the state of Colorado. Before my time, yes, fully Colorado National Forests. One, I'm proud to say, bears my name here in the state of Colorado, which I'm very proud. Again, Congress would not have allowed it. But national forests, this may surprise you as well, that there was one particular senator from Oregon who was in the back pocket of the lumber industry, those timber barons, and he attached a rider to an appropriations bill that I had to sign. Elsewise, I would have caused one of these government shutdowns that are so popular in your time, where your leaders of government failed to do their jobs. I had to sign this appropriations bill, and it was, the rider was, it would strip the power of me and future presidents to name forest reserves in the northwestern states. But I knew my Constitution. I had 10 days before I had to sign this bill, and so I sat down in those 10 days with my chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, and we pored over the maps of the western United States. And do you know that in those 10 days we found 16 million new acres of national forests, some of them in the state of Oregon, just to show that we could. So this heritage of conservation by presidential declaration, I'm proud to have attached my name to these national forests, to these game preserves. But I remained a hunter to the very end. And I hunted through my presidency. And for all of my other accomplishments, I probably am most known for a failed hunting trip early in my presidency. You see, I had some political business I had to take care of down in southern Mississippi. And the governor of Mississippi invited me to go on a black bear hunt. I think he wanted to be able to brag that Mr. Roosevelt hunted and killed a black bear in Mississippi, and he wanted me to take this thing back to the White House and be the first state to supply a bear trophy to the president. So, out of my power, the governor invited dozens of other people on this hunting trip. So you can either have a picnic or a county fair or a hunting trip. You can't have both. There were dozens of us tromping around through the southern cane brakes of southern Mississippi, scared off every bear in all of the southern United States, probably. I retired back to my tent in our hunting camp when somebody came running into the camp and said, Mr. President, we have your bear, come quick. So I grabbed my rifle, my trusty Winchester 94, and off I went, thinking that we were going to follow the trail of this terrible black bear, and I was going to get my trophy after all. When what do I see when I arrive on the scene but this terrible catastrophe of these dead hunting dogs laying at the feet of this bludgeoned black bear, this old beaten, grizzled black bear, whom the hunting guide had beaten over the head with his rifle, tied it to a tree, and they said, Mr. Roosevelt, there's your bear. Come shoot your bear, claim your trophy. Now I founded the Boone and Crockett Club, for goodness sakes. I had promoted ethical hunting practices and fair chase. How in the world was I going to shoot a bear that had been beaten and bludgeoned, tied to a tree? So I refused. Then the next day, I saw the cartoons. And there I was in the cartoons, standing with my rifle, with my arm extended, saying, I will not shoot the bear. And instead of a ferocious, that beaten up, bludgeoned, huge black bear, tied to the tree was this cute, fuzzy little bear cub. And it captured the imagination of the American people. When I returned to the White House, there was a letter from a Mr. Morris Mictum. And he said, he operated a small little toy shop and said, my wife has started sewing up these little stuffed bears. And we wondered, might we use your name in the promotion of these bears? And I said, I can't imagine that the Roosevelt name is much good in the bear business, but be my guest, go ahead. So for all my accomplishments, as politician, as soldier, statesman, hunter, naturalist, writer of over 40 books, this is my legacy. Teddy's Bear, as it was marketed as. And I understand Mr. and Mrs. Michtom did good business. Sit. So finally, I want to leave something with you. I want you to understand that this hard work that you are doing on the part of conservation here in the San Luis Valley, in the game refuge system, there are those who will not share your vision for conservation and habitat protection. But I want you to disregard those naysayers. I want you to take heart in words that I spoke to the members of the Sorbonne in 1910. I said, it isn't the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or how the doer of deeds could have done them better. No, the credit belongs to the man and today the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly and who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his name will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Yes, it is hard to fail, but it is worse to have never tried to succeed. I encourage you, good people here in the San Luis Valley, continue this good work that you are doing. It is work worth doing, and I salute you. I thank you very much. God bless. Thank you so much. Now, as president, I was the first president to actually provide permanent space for the media in the White House and had regular press conferences, something that probably most of my successors deeply regret. But in that spirit, if there are any questions that any of you might have for me as president, I would gladly try to answer them. Do you let your current president off this easy? Yes, ma'am.
I understand that you came to Glenwood Springs and stayed at the Colorado Hotel.
Colorado Hotel, yes. I understand the Colorado Hotel bills that as the Western White House because of my brief stay there, but it is true. In 1905, I came west as president. Again, I took those opportunities to come hunt whenever I could. I wouldn't let the presidency stand in the way of a good hunting trip. And I did come west in the late spring of 1905 on a bear hunt on the western slope. And during that time, on my bear hunt, I was also negotiating what would become a peace treaty between the Russia and the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. And so I had my aide stationed at the Hotel Colorado, and I received these telegrams back and forth, and so I was trying to stay abreast of the situation for my hunting trip. But yes, on the way back through, before I left the state of Colorado, I did stay at the Hotel Colorado.
Thank you for doing so.
Yes, a fine place. I hope they have me back soon. And yes, you sir, in the flannel shirt.
Did you ever hunt or ride an elephant in Bandit to It, Vietnam?
Not to my memory, sir. Not to my memory. I understand there are these things today on your World Wide Web called memes. And I am sometimes pictured riding various wild creatures on the backs of hippopotamus, or I believe I even saw one example of me riding a T-Rex. I have no recollections of that either, sir. Any other? Yes, you, ma'am.
So you had a prolonged residence in the White House and had a profound influence on conservation as a member of the Republican Party. To be what we call now politically correct,
Oh dear.
why in your visionary mind would you see that the Republican Party today does not take on the mission of conservation?
Oh my, look at the time. Was that the final question? Yes, I would, in doing some of my, I do like to read. I do style myself as an historian, and in my readings, I noted that John Quincy Adams set aside about 1,300 acres of live oak in the state of Florida in his presidency, and the next president, a wild-eyed populist, criticized him for being a wild federal land grab. Yes. The Republican Party today, I've often been asked, Mr. Roosevelt, would you be a member of today's Republican Party? During my time, I remained a loyal member of the Republican Party, but I sought to reform it in a progressive way within the party. Yes, I bolted from the party in 1912 and ran as a bull moose progressive in a very short-lived third party. We got second place, by the way. But yes, I think I would still try to stay within a Republican Party, but reform it from within. But again, yours is the world of today. I may be a creature of the past, but the progressive issues that I stood for when I was president and running under the progressive label in 1912, I was labeled a wild-eyed radical socialist for embracing such ideas as a minimum living wage, getting children out of the industrial workplace, actually considering giving women the right to vote. Crazy stuff, right? These were the progressive issues of a century ago. I understand the Republican Party has endorsed most of those now. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Tell us about your trip to the Amazon.
The trip to the Amazon. Yes, this was what I described as my last chance to be a boy. And I begged Edith, and again, Edith was a gracious and consenting woman, my wife Edith, and she understood that I was low for losing the 1912 election as a progressive, and I was asked to go down on a lecture tour to South America. And I was then asked if I would accompany a Colonel Rondon on an expedition into the Amazon and on a collection expedition and an exploration of was known as the River of Doubt. Now, on that River of Doubt expedition, I took along, again, my son Kermit, who had accompanied me to Africa on a hunting trip after my presidency in 1909. And it was Kermit that probably saved my life. You see, on that trip, we were deep into the Amazon, and I had to jump into the waters and cut a pretty sizable gash on my lower leg on the boats as I was trying to keep them from washing away down the river. And it became infected, and I became delirious and was fighting through 105-degree fevers and started chanting lines from old poetry that I had memorized as a child. How did it go? In Xanadu, did Kubla Khan pleasure dome did decree. I apparently was delirious and chanting that over and over until probably members of the party wished that I would die. My son Kermit is actually credited with saving me. I asked to actually be left there to die. Whether I was so delirious, but I didn't want to endanger the rest of the crew. You see, we were so far into the Amazon, we were losing some of the members of our work, some of the work party were jumping ship, running into the jungle, and abandoning our efforts, and it was questionable whether we would even return. And I had beefed up a bit in my post-presidential years, and I had lost nearly 50 pounds during that trip, and I came back in the fit, trim shape that you see me tonight. So yes, it was an expedition that nearly cost me my life, and perhaps for that they renamed it the Real Roosevelt in my honor instead of the River of Doubt. So, but that is credited with causing the infections, which would become a blood infection that would lead to my demise, my corporal demise, at the age of only 60 years of age, 1919. I'm told that I did more in 60 years than some men do, and several men do in several lifetimes. Any other, you? Yes, you in the very back.
So you wrote about an encounter that you had heard, I think it was another hunter, about possibly Sasquatch, although you've never believed it as such. Do you believe in Sasquatch?
I believe that I described that as a ghost tale of Sasquatch. It's interesting, somebody just earlier today was telling me that in your very region has been spotted, or at least there is reason to believe that Sasquatch lives amongst you here in southern Colorado. I'm not certain that I endorse the story, but it sure makes good reading. I'm not certain that I believe in the Loch Ness Monster either, but that makes a good story. So yes, I'm intrigued that the Sasquatch may live here in southern Colorado.
I take that as a yes.
I've always liked a good ghost story to be told around the fire. Yes. Is that a hand up in the back? Yes, you, sir.
Book would you recommend reading that portrays your life most accurately?
Which book would I want you to read that portrays my life most accurately? It's funny that you ask. This fellow here, this Edmund Morris, has created I think a likeness to my life that can be trusted, a trilogy of works. The first one being The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, the next one being Theodore Rex, and the third volume of Colonel Roosevelt. I think if you want a mere 2,000 pages worth of reading to get a general impression of my life, this is a decent short read. As regards the as regards the topic of conservation, I cannot say enough good about Douglas Brinkley's The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. I wish I'd thought of that. This is an excellent book that I would heartily endorse as Theodore Roosevelt. I don't believe they are on sale in the back. But yes, this is probably as regards conservation, one of the finest works that you can find. And again, it's a short read of just a little over 800 pages. Well worth your time, I think. As regards there's a Mark Gardner who wrote a book on the Rough Riders. I think that I would endorse that volume as well. There is another book on my writing life called Theodore Roosevelt, A Literary Life. I would endorse that book as well. I was a literary feller, as I like to style myself. I wrote some 40 books in my lifetime and at least 150,000 letters that have been collected in the Library of Congress, I believe most of which are available in a digitized format to you today. So yes, A Literary Life, I endorse that.
The book TR by Brand.
By Mr. Brands.
How accurate is that?
Less so with the romantic, the Mr. Brands. That is a good book. I think still, I would invest the 2,000 pages worth of reading for Mr. Morris's trilogy. But I think Mr. Brands hits the mark correctly in a number of ways. Yes, yes, sir. Is there a hand up in the back?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, sir.
You had a camping trip with John Muir. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, the hunting trip with Mr. Muir, yes. I really should have given Mr. Muir more time here tonight, shouldn't I? It was that same 1903 trip that I saw the Grand Canyon for the first time. And what a glorious trip that was in 1903, seeing much of the West, seeing Yellowstone, and then out to the Yosemite. And Mr. Muir was hoping to get my attention to save parts of the Yosemite, and he was just certain that if he had some time that he could spend with me, that he could convince me, in his words, to stop that childish obsession with killing birds. But he believed that, again, Mr. Muir was a preservationist, and he devoted much of his life to setting aside the Yosemite and getting it national park status. But what a glorious couple of days that we spent. And when I first arrived in the Yosemite Valley, I was confronted with these horrible signs up on nailed to the trees, nailed to these sequoias and redwoods. Welcome, Mr. President. We're glad to see you in California, Mr. President. And I said, I will not speak. I'm going to go away for a few minutes. And when I come back, if those signs are still there, you all have to go away. Do you know that they removed them? So there's no place for these gaudy advertisements in this beauty that is this creation. And I was able to spend 2 glorious days in the presence of John Muir, and we camped out under this canopy of the sequoia and these redwoods. And if you've never been out to California to see these California redwoods and sequoias, it's a sight that every American should see. That and the Grand Canyon, I've said. What a glorious, glorious sight it is. This is nature's cathedral. Again, Europe has its man-made monuments to itself, with Notre Dame and with the Salzburg Cathedral. This is our national treasure. And again, I implore the people of California, keep these great forests as they are. That these were saplings in the Roman Empire. Some of these trees perhaps were growing when they were still putting up the last of the pyramids of Egypt. Should they be turned into outdoor furniture? Or should we keep them for our children and our children's children. Preserve them for the future generations. These are our national treasures. And Mr. Muir opened my eyes to the need to preserve the the Yosemite Valley. And we did have a falling out. And again, I am a conservationist, and Mr. Muir is a preservationist. And the Hetch Hetchy Valley proved to be a point of contention between the two of us, and I, believing that the greatest use for the greatest number of people for the longest time meant a flooding of the Hetch Hetchy Valley, and I'm not sure that Mr. Muir ever forgave me for that. But in the aftermath of the 1906 earthquakes in San Francisco, the water was needed for this population center in the West. And so unfortunately, our ideas diverged as regards the Hetch Hetchy, but I will never forget my time spent with John Muir. We woke up on one glorious morning covered in snow. I slept out with dozens of wool blankets, and it was delightful to be in God's nature in this cathedral that is our national treasure. Any other questions before I?
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you regret not having the opportunity to tweet.
I'm afraid that I would be a great nuisance with the tweet. I was diligent in my responses to correspondence. I would always answer a letter the day that I received it, and again wrote over 150,000 letters. And I'm afraid I would likewise be quite obnoxious with the Twitter account. But I would hope that I would use it for more constructive purposes than some of my successes, perhaps. Well, I'm going to, yes.
Mr. President, it's just been, just 100 years ago, you signed the Antiquities Act, right?
I did, in 1906.
Yes. So, in our progressive times now, 100 years later, your successor believes that the Antiquities Act can be used to eliminate or reduce a monument. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. It's funny you ask. My last official act as President of the United States was to create Mount Olympus National Monument. You see, the forests around Mount Olympus were in jeopardy of being cut down by, again, that Northwest timber industry was in the back pockets of all of the U.S. senators of the Pacific Northwest. So I used by executive order in the last days of my presidency, I used the executive order to set aside 600,000 acres of forests around Mount Olympus as a national monument. And that later has become a national park. But Mr. Wilson, in his view, believed that 600,000 acres was too much, and he reduced that by half. He reduced it to 300,000 acres, and every president after him didn't have the intestinal fortitude to stand up to the timber industry of the Northwest until my little cousin, Franklin, increased the acreage back to its original size, and it later became a national park. So yes, I feel very strongly that once so declared, there needs to be some legitimate reasons for reducing that in size. There have always been the claims of federal land grabs whenever any type of an area is set aside for the interest of the American people. So, yes, I understand in your day this is something that you continue to contend with, that a national monument once set aside by executive order, so declaring it can likewise be reduced by the next president. But when I so declared something, I meant it. Fully. Well, I want to thank you, as myself, Kurt Skinner, for giving me the opportunity to talk to you tonight, for your patience. I know some people, their patience was, it's been a very long day for some of the people, but I want to thank you for your time and your attention. I want to tell you, as somebody who tries to do a faithful representation through respect to this man, that I so admire. One of Roosevelt's contemporaries said that after you spend an evening with Roosevelt in the White House, you have to go home and wring the personality out of your clothes. He was such a larger than life character that it can be pretty intimidating to try to step into the shoes and the skin of somebody like Roosevelt. But again, as an historian, I have admired Roosevelt my entire life, and this is a labor of love for me. And I just appreciate the opportunity of being able to present him for you tonight. So I don't know if there's any questions about that, but otherwise, I appreciate it. Thank you. Yes?
Can you tell us something about you, where you're from, and do you just tell us about you? Quite good. Yes, Ted.
The Kurt Skinner version. So I'm originally from Kansas. I served I retired from the Air Force in 2010 and retired into a teaching career. I teach American history and social studies at Colorado Springs Christian School. So that's our home now. And it's been a bully second career that I've really enjoyed. When I was in the Air Force, I was stationed in North Dakota at a place called Minot Air Force Base in the middle of the North Dakotans are. You've experienced Minot, North Dakota? Mm-hmm. Bully? The 91st Missile Wing that I was a part of, the nickname was the Rough Riders, because they took that from our time in, it was Roosevelt's time spent in North Dakota, and so this was a tie into the Badlands and his time in the military. And so we were the 91st Missile Wing Rough Riders, going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Spanish-American War that year with a big dining in, a big celebration. We brought in the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, a guy called Tweed Roosevelt, who was descended through Roosevelt's son Archie. And he came there, and I had the opportunity to meet this man, and I was in the office with my boss, the wing commander, when he had an office visit, and so I got to see him interacting and got to talk to him a little bit. And the wing had a Theodore Roosevelt trivia contest that, again, in my pridefulness, I had to win. And so I crammed on Roosevelt. I didn't know a great deal about him, and it was Morris's works and other biographies that I took my hands on 2 or 3 of those, and I just started cramming, and I fell in love with this guy, Theodore Roosevelt, and there was so much to admire about him that I've over time just kind of filled up a bookshelf on Theodore Roosevelt. And the more that I learned about him, it's just, I find this as a historian, as a teacher, a history teacher, whatever unit you're going through at the time has to be your favorite unit. But with Roosevelt, it's just, there are so many aspects, so many facets of this man's life that it can be my sole academic study, I think, for as long as I live, and you'll never really capture everything there is to know about him. But this is my way of, I think, my own personal way of just trying to honor this guy that I so respect. and Theodore Roosevelt, and just share. There's something to love about this guy in almost every group, whether it's hunters, whether it's conservationists, whether it's intellectuals. Roosevelt he read. There were days apparently where he read at least a book a day. He read all the time. He wrote through everything in his life. There wasn't a time in his life where he wasn't writing. And on his trip in South America, while he's suffering with malaria and 105-degree fever, he's still writing. All through his time that year in Africa, he's writing every day and sending his proofs to scriveners to be printed as serials that later gets turned into books. He's writing his entire lifetime, so he's an intellectual. He muddles through several foreign languages, European languages. He's widely traveled. He went on what was called, for wealthy families, the Grand Tour of Europe, and he traveled through North Africa, spent time in Egypt, he spent time in the Middle East as a kid. Just incredibly well traveled. People have asked me if Roosevelt would have been president in World War I, if World War I would have been averted. We'll never know, but he had such a command of all of the personalities of the day, and he had the respect of world leaders, even as the next president, that I just wonder if he could have used his influence in the same way that he negotiated the Russo-Japanese conflict to an end, which he won the Pulitzer Prize for, by the way. So this is a guy he wins the Pulitzer Prize for peacekeeping, for bringing peace amongst nations, but has the mantle of being a warrior because of his whopping 4 months in military uniform in the Spanish-American War. But he's his own best press. He wrote his account of the Spanish-American War called The Rough Riders, as you probably know. The joke was that the printer ran out of the personal pronoun I, The Rough Riders. But again, this is a guy who posthumously, at least, it was about the final act of President Bill Clinton in 2001 that Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his time in Cuba. So he's got some decent credentials to be president. Again, he was the youngest assemblyman in the state of New York at the age of 23. He's a Western rancher, owns 2 ranches in the Badlands. He was a civil service commissioner under 2 different presidents, fighting against the whole spoils system and trying to bring about merit within the federal job system. And then he's picked up to be a commissioner of the police board in New York City, and he does that for a couple of years, and then he gets the chance to become the assistant secretary of the Navy. Then he gives that up so he can go run off to war and go put himself in harm's way of Spanish bullets. He believed so strongly. He helped bring about the Spanish-American War that it was his responsibility as a man to stand up for, he didn't want to be an armchair jingo like so many people who had advocated for war, and then the first opportunity shirks his responsibility. He said, I'm going to put my body on the line here. People thought he was a fool. He left. He went off to Cuba with 6 children, and the first, his youngest being just barely newborn. 6 children, sick wife. He runs off to war, and his boss, the Navy Department secretary, said, it was just foolhardy. Why would you do that? Wouldn't it be? You're probably just going to die of malaria in some Central American country, or wouldn't it be Wouldn't it be interesting if, by some strange turn of fate, that you actually achieved something noteworthy in Cuba, which, of course, he did. He became a household name. He said, "I rose like a rocket." So the joke was, he got promoted essentially from colonel to president through that Spanish-American War fame. So, but again, just all the hunter conservationist efforts today. People compare Theodore Roosevelt with what he does for conservation of almost with what Whitman and Thoreau do to the early conservation movement. That's why Medora, North Dakota, is kind of being touted as, his ranches there in the Badlands are kind of this conservation ground zero for the modern conservation movement, because it's there where he did formulate so many of these ideas about the scarcity of resources, and he saw the effects of overgrazing. He saw how man so easily contributes to the extinction of species, and the need for habitat that just kind of all coalesced out there, and it really turned him into the man he is. He famously says, "I wouldn't be president if it wasn't for my time spent in North Dakota," which I know North Dakota gets a lot of mileage out of that. Bully. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.